Everybody. We are coming to the end of 2023. I want to thank everybody on the podcast, listeners out there, you podcasters out there. We recorded almost 31 hours of podcast in 2023, and it was fabulous. Tons of feedback. I can't thank everybody enough who's subscribing and hitting that follow button wherever you're listening, or subscribing on YouTube. So I can't thank everybody enough. Today's podcast is no exception. It's going to be fantastic. We've interviewed this guy before. His name is Sam Dolan. Now, Sam Dolan, the last time we spoke was June 11th of 2022. You can find him back in my history. Go scroll through, find it, because the reason I want you guys to do, if you haven't listened to the Sam Dolan, the first one, we really talk about his beginnings in television and creating documentaries and being in the movie Tombstone and where he grew up and how he got into where he's at. We're not going to cover any of that today. So go back to that first interview. Today we're going to be talking about his new book that he's got out now. It's called The Line Riders: The Border Patrol, Prohibition, and the Liquor War on the Rio Grand. And I can't wait to dive into this one. Before we do that, I want to thank my friends at the Tombstone Epitaph, Arizona's longest running newspaper. Be sure to go to tombstoneepitaph.com, be a subscriber, get it delivered right to your door. You're going to love it. Sam does some articles here and there, but it's like 20 plus pages, and it's just fantastic Western history. Of course, I want to thank my second family at the Wild West History Association. You can be a member and join, and go to wildwesthistory.org, wildwesthistory.org, and join. It's $75. You get the journal, and you just pack full. And in 2023, we're going to the Alamo for our roundup. So we're going to the Alamo for our roundup. Did I say that we did 31 hours in 2023? I think I screwed up on that. It was 31 hours in 2022. But I'm already ahead of myself thinking about next year. But I want to thank everybody. So again, go to wildwesthistory.org and be a subscriber, become a member, and get the journal and some amazing people delivered right to your door. So back in June, I had actually, before that, I think around January, I had bought the book El Paso, because there was a recommendation by our mutual friend, John Bosnecker, and John had made this recommendation on Facebook that said, you've got to go get this book. Well, John says it, I'm going to do it. And I went down and I bought the book, and I've said this before to Sam, so it's nothing that's a secret. It's a slow read. And the reason I say it's a slow read is it's so packed full of information, and it's extremely detailed. So if you just blow by something, sometimes I'd read it. Oh, God, did I read that right? And I'd read that page again. And sometimes I'd go back and reread the chapter because there was so much to it. But Sam fueled my interest in El Paso, the town. And so I went there for business, and I couldn't, I ended up at the Concordia, the cemetery, went and saw John Wesley Hardin's gravesite, and that was just the tip of it. Well, he did the podcast with me in June. Fabulous podcast. We learned so much about Sam and his life. But then in the middle of that, it was realizing in my head, like, there's got to be more. And then lo and behold, Line Riders show up. So welcome, sir. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Happy New Year.
Well, Happy New Year, Mike, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I appreciate it.
I'll follow you around when you become rich and famous and you're in a private plane and, go out on stage. Oh my God, it's Sam. I'll do your introduction for free.
Well, that's great. I that might be a long wait, but I appreciate that.
For free. Listen, I'm cheap, just a free beer and bag of peanuts and I'm good.
Well, that's a deal.
So you wrote a new book. It's called The Line Riders. And correct me if I'm wrong, was there information that you had dug up in writing El Paso that you began to push aside to where all of a sudden I've got this whole nother story I want to tell about the line riders, or were they two separate?
No, they're all sort of connected. And I have a third book, my first book, Cowboys and Gangsters, that was published in 2016. That was sort of where the research for the line riders began. I had a lot of information. I did a lot of research on both the Customs Service and the Immigration Border Patrol during the 1920s. I wasn't able to use, very much of that for Cowboys and Gangsters, and so I held on to it, and then I continued to do research while working on El Paso. And then there were characters and incidents, especially in the early 20th century there in El Paso, Texas, that I sort of held on to. I felt that they would fall within the Line Riders project. It would just be a better fit. Of course, I started writing the Line Riders the year before the pandemic began. And I'm sure you'll hear this from other authors, and I certainly talk to other historians about this a lot lately. And the pandemic had a huge impact on research and the writing of books, because if you do this work and you take it seriously, you're constantly working with public agencies, whether it's, district courthouses in various counties, the National Archives, obviously, if you need federal records, and I often do. Well, of course, all of that shut down. And it had a huge impact on the book I was writing. Speaking frankly, I had intended to cover a sort of a longer span of time with this book. And I have a lot of material that I could still have used, but I ended up focusing primarily on the Prohibition era. I felt that it was relatively untapped. There haven't been that many books written about Prohibition in the Southwest in terms of a sort of a law enforcement sort of angle. And when you talk about Prohibition with people, they automatically think of New York and Chicago and Al Capone and places and people like that. They very rarely think of the American West, and especially the Southwest. But as I illustrate in the book, the international boundary, the border with Mexico, was a very active place for smuggling and bootlegging. And as a result, there was a considerable amount of violence during the 1920s and well into the 1930s there. And so that's really what I cover in the book. And fortunately, I was able to tap into a wonderful resource through the National Archives and researchers that helped me access some of those documents, and then direct requests I made to branches of the National Archives before the pandemic, and then once sort of the restrictions had lifted. The book primarily covers the Prohibition era, but if you're reading it closely, there are connections to both Cowboys and Gangsters and El Paso as well.
So January of 1920, the 18th Amendment is passed. It went into effect. Here's what it says: is it went into effect for the sale of intoxicating spirits was outlawed.
Yes.
And so the thirst for liquor didn't just go away. People just didn't pass the 18th Amendment and go, oh, good, I'm dry. Like it continued, and all of this stuff was coming across from Mexico. And I'm reading another book. Like I told you, I'm reading John Bosnecker's book about Frank Hamer. Like there was so much action going on between Juarez and El Paso and along the Mexican border and the Texas border that the need for law and law enforcement was really needed.
Well, that's 100% correct. And in truth, as far as the southwestern states are concerned, like say specifically Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, a series of state prohibition laws that were passed between those three states between 1914 and 1919 plus wartime restrictions. A lot of folks forget that during World War One, the federal government passed a number of wartime measures aimed at restricting the production of alcohol for drinking purposes and the sale of alcohol in certain places where you might have a city or a town that's in close proximity to a military installation. They wanted to keep our forces that were gearing up to go overseas to go fight in France. They wanted to keep them sober. Of course, that was, a hopeless effort, but that was the idea. And so towns like El Paso, if you were to look at that town in like the spring of 1918, El Paso was kind of coming out of its frontier period, sort of like Wild West, time frame. It still had sort of vestiges of that. It still had a lot of saloons. There was still an element of El Paso that was very much sort of entrenched in its frontier experience. Well, World War One sort of killed that off. The proximity of Fort Bliss and a number of other satellite camps and installations for forces that were preparing to mobilize to go to France, and also were still posted on the border to monitor and police the border because of what was going on in Mexico during the latter years of the Mexican Revolution. Well, there were a lot of soldiers in El Paso, and so the wartime liquor restrictions shuttered all the saloons there. And so you already had bootlegging and smuggling happening along that particular stretch of the border before January of 1920. In fact, the first immigration officer that was killed in a deliberate act of violence anywhere on the border in American history was killed in El Paso in the spring of 1919, probably 9 months before the Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment actually went into effect for enforcement purposes. And so you already had a situation on the border, and even a few years before that in Arizona, there was a lot of smuggling going on, and of course, violence that came along with it. And so the Prohibition era, in terms of sort of a law enforcement experience, if you will, and the violence associated with it, that began even before January of 1920.
So there's violence. They're bringing liquor into America from Mexico.
Sure.
And then it's determined, because a lot of the men that became line riders or river guards were Texas Rangers, were they not?
That's correct. A lot of the customs officers in particular, now immigration officers also, but the customs service was staffed, particularly in Texas, with a lot of former Rangers. The work was essentially very similar, especially for Texas Rangers that had been, in companies that were posted in West Texas or in South Texas on the river. The job was kind of translatable. The skills were. Most of these officers were appointed by customs collectors. So for a lot of these customs officers, there were no civil service regulations. So if you had experience as a Texas Ranger, you had served in one of the companies during the old days of the Frontier Battalion, or even during the early State Ranger period in the early 20th century, you had sort of the requisite skills. You could ride a horse, you could provide your own weapons. There were really no uniforms for most of these officers that were sort of working in the outside force out on the range. So a lot of former Rangers, guys like Herf Carnes, he and his brother had both been Texas Rangers. His brother had been killed as a Ranger in a shootout in 1910. Herf Carnes became a customs officer. Joe Sitter was another Texas Ranger that became a customs inspector. He was killed in 1915 in West Texas. Robert Rumsey was another officer that I talk quite a bit about in the early chapters of this book. Rumsey had been a Ranger in the early 20th century and then became a customs officer. The customs officers, the federal officers, were paid better. And so it was sort of an attractive, transition. I can't quite remember what a private because the Rangers at this time, they were under the Adjutant General. So it was still sort of a military sort of structure. So you enlisted in the Rangers. And for a long time, you didn't even have a badge. Mm-hmm. You had a commission, you enlisted in the Rangers as a private, and you drew so much a month. Well, the federal officers, their, per annum salaries were better. And so a lot of these Rangers made a transition to the Customs Service and the Immigration Service. One officer I write about, Jim Dunaway, he had been a Texas Ranger. He had a mixed reputation. I believe he served under Captain McDonald and Captain Henry Ransom, who, of course, was very controversial. Dunaway had been involved in a number of highly questionable shooting incidents as a Ranger. And then he pistol whipped a young man in Fredericksburg, Texas, and was essentially, I think, forced to resign if he wasn't, dropped from the muster. And not long thereafter, he became an immigration officer, and he served in both Texas and later in Arizona. Was sort of a precursor to the Border Patrol, the old mounted watchman.
Crazy. So all this is going on, but what? And they're trying to fight and stop smuggling, of liquor. Were they successful? Because the reason I ask that is, there seems to be more of them than there are of us. And, they're trying to patrol the border in an untamed area. Today there's roads that parallel the border. But then a lot of areas had lots and lots of open land. Was it easy or was it difficult? Was it a difficult patrol?
It was an incredibly difficult patrol. By some measure, they were successful in the sense that customs officers and immigration officers, now, by virtue of the fact that they were federal law enforcement officers, they had the authority to enforce the National Prohibition Act, the Volstead Act. And so while it wasn't specifically the real idea of their job descriptions, immigration officers and Border Patrol inspectors were primarily there to enforce the immigration laws. By virtue of the fact that they were on the border, and often the folks that were crossing the border surreptitiously were also smuggling alcohol during this period. And so they seized massive quantities of alcohol. Some of it sort of, typical sort of or regional drinks like tequila and mezcal, but also a lot of whiskey and alcohol that had been imported into Mexico from distilleries in the United States ahead of January of 1920. So a lot of that booze made its way back across the Rio Grande. They were successful up to a point, but it was sort of just a perpetual battle because it's a long border and you have a relatively small force of officers that have to patrol that border, working either alone or in pairs or in, trios of officers later on. And it wasn't uncommon for 2 or 3 or 4 Border Patrol inspectors to go down to a popular crossing point along the river, either right within El Paso or other stretches of the border, and have a gunfight with, smugglers coming across the line that, were escorted by gunmen that were meant to protect the shipment of alcohol. And a large number of federal officers were killed during the Prohibition era. Something like 19 were killed just in El Paso between 1919 and December of 1933. That's a lot of law enforcement officers to die in one city during that period of time. And that doesn't account for all of the officers that were killed or maimed or wounded, along that 2,000-mile, border. And of course, they killed a lot of smugglers. So there was a huge attrition rate, a huge cost of human life associated with enforcing a really almost unenforceable policy. This idea that you're going to legislate your way into national sobriety is fairly preposterous. But the consequences of that are that you have to have officers that enforce those laws, and there are incredible risks associated with that during that time period.
Well, by now, you should be saying to yourself, my God, I got to get this book. I've got to buy it. I've got to read it because it is packed full of photos. And so definitely going to want to get that. Tons of photos. And if you're wondering, again, we're talking to Sam Dolan. He has written a new book. It's called The Line Riders, The Border Patrol, Prohibition, and the Liquor War on the Rio Grand. Now, you can buy the book at Amazon. It's really the best place, especially if you're in Europe, you're overseas, you're living someplace where shipping is really expensive. I urge you to go on Amazon, buy the book there. Right now, I think it's around the $25 range. And so for $25, you get it plus minimal shipping on Amazon, and you can get it delivered anywhere you live in the world. And so I really urge you guys to get this one and get El Paso too, because the two of them together make a great pairing. And you can really get to see. And then what was the first book? The first book is in paperback only, I think, right now.
Yeah, the first book is paperback only. It's called Cowboys and Gangsters. And that book, I cover lawlessness and crime in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, basically between about 1917 and the early 30s.
So all of this is available on Amazon. And again, we're talking to Sam Dolan. He has written the new book, or wrote the new book, The Line Riders, The Border Patrol, Prohibition, and the Liquor War on the Rio Grande. Now, you had mentioned earlier in a statement that they weren't just moving alcohol. I think there were cigars, mezcal, there was like all sorts of other goods. Is that correct?
Oh, of course. I mean, as long as there's been an international boundary between, the United States and Mexico, there has been at least some illicit trade along the border. And, way back in the 1800s, it was not unusual for smugglers to transport goods across the border in violation of the tariff laws because they were, trying to avoid paying, duty on those goods. And sometimes the customers didn't want to pay duty on those goods. So cigars, bolts of cloth, various household goods available in Mexico at attractive prices were transported across the border every day. Now, some of this smuggling was kind of casual smuggling. Individuals would go across the border and they might be, caught coming back across one of the bridges in El Paso with, things stuffed in their pockets or in the lining of their clothes. More professional smugglers, generally crossed the border in less populated areas, maybe with pack animals, with ammunition, with, a lot of cigars, of course, mezcal and tequila and other alcohol. And there were run-ins and violent encounters between customs officers and other lawmen throughout the American West on the border and those smugglers. Generally, those offenders, would be arrested. They could be looking at a year or so in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. For some of them, that was enough to curtail that, particular part of their lives and their careers. And some were career smugglers. And I cover a couple of those in this book. And these were individuals whose smuggling careers sort of encapsulated that whole period. They may have helped escort Chinese laborers across the river and into the United States in violation of the really odious Chinese Exclusion Acts. They might have helped smuggle horses across the river or ammunition during the Mexican Revolution. And then some of these guys, years later into the 20s and 30s, were helping smuggle alcohol across the river or narcotics, during the Prohibition era.
So as the line riders are growing, I would assume they're growing, they're bringing more people in, more men into the line riders to enforce the border. Was pay really good? Like, were they compensated really well? They're putting their life on the line. So was pay decent enough to attract more men?
Pay was, relatively modest. It wasn't, completely outrageous, but, for example, I think about 1924, a customs inspector, so a mounted customs inspector made about, I think the annual salary was something like $1,800 per year. And an immigration officer who actually was subject to civil service requirements, their pay was a little bit less than that for doing very similar work. And that was about $1,600 or maybe almost $1,700 per annum. And there was at times a little bit of friction between officers of the two agencies. Today we talk about Customs and Border Patrol. These services have, they've evolved. They're part of the Department of Homeland Security. There's a little more unity in sort of how all of that is organized. The organization of all of that is quite different. In the 1920s, you had sort of two separate, distinct agencies with overlapping duties. You had the customs officers and you had the immigration officers, members of the Border Patrol. And a lot of these officers knew each other. Some had served in both agencies at times. Some of these officers had served as Texas Rangers, possibly together in years past. But there were rivalries. There are often jurisdictional rivalries, just like there would be today between certain agencies. And that could get pretty heated back then, and especially so if you have officers that are not being paid a lot and they find out that, somebody they know that's working for the other service is maybe getting another $200 a year. That's a lot of money back then. Right. That's a big difference. And, there was some friction between the two forces, but there was also a lot of examples where these officers worked together. They were in some of the same fights together. If an officer from one of these services was killed, officers from the other might help investigate that with the other authorities involved. And so it wasn't always a toxic situation, but there were times, especially in South Texas, the collector of customs there was a controversial figure and was at various times accused of varying shades of corruption. Primarily by members of the Immigration Service and former members of the Customs Service.
So during this period, after the 18th Amendment, during this decade, 20s and 30s, there had to be some scrutiny though, right? They were doing this job protecting the border. Was there scrutiny? Was the public behind it? Was the public looking to officials? I know I'm like, it's a broad brush thing, but there couldn't have been 100% where everybody was 100% backing him. So was there controversy?
Yeah, I would say there was. There were just like there would be today. There were people who, from the very beginning, were not in favor of the National Prohibition Act, who were not in favor of the state prohibition laws that were passed in many of the states around the country, not just along the border. And so there were mixed feelings throughout this time. And I think that especially as the Prohibition era wore on, sort of in terms of the 18th Amendment, you're talking like 13 years, which is a long time. It's a long time for that amount of bloodshed throughout the country. And when it was all said and done, collectively speaking, our country certainly just didn't have the willpower to, continue to fund the enforcement of a very unpopular legislation. You had multiple law enforcement agencies involved in the enforcement of the liquor laws. The Bureau of Internal Revenue, which, like the Customs Service, served under the Department of the Treasury, had its own law enforcement agencies specifically geared towards prohibition. And they, of course, intermingled with the Border Patrol and the Customs Service in the Southwest. The Prohibition Unit. These are the prohibition agents that you often see depicted in TV shows and movies. And these officers were somewhat hastily recruited and hired on early in the Prohibition era without any regard to civil service guidelines. So you had a mixture of good officers like Frank Hamer. You mentioned John's book, Texas Ranger, which is his biography of Frank Hamer. Frank Hamer, Captain Charles Stevens, both of them Texas Rangers. They left the Rangers in the early 20s and both became federal prohibition agents. So you had genuine lawmen that became proes, as they were known. You also had a lot of hacks and novices that managed to get those jobs, and there was a huge turnover rate. There was a lot of corruption. There were many agents that were arrested for a variety of crimes and prosecuted. And those crimes include, of course, violations of the liquor laws that they were sworn to uphold. So there was corruption involved, but then also homicide and assault and, misuse of firearms and all manner of things. There's very little regulation over that agency, especially in the early 20s. Now, as time went on, there was reorganization. In 1927, the Bureau of Prohibition was sort of reorganized and improved upon, and then it fell under Department of Justice towards the end of the Prohibition era. But it was never an agency that was looked upon as with a tremendous amount of respect. Anecdotally, I think that, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, was very anxious about the idea that prohibition enforcement was going to fall under the FBI's mandate because of the sort of tarnished reputation that the Bureau of Prohibition had by the early 1930s. That's not to say that individual officers were very dedicated, and quite a few were murdered or killed in gunfights all over the country, but especially along the Mexican border. In El Paso, in the spring of 1921, right in the immediate vicinity of the city, both within the city and then up in sort of outside of Anthony, New Mexico, which today is sort of almost a suburb of El Paso. You had 4 federal prohibition agents killed in the spring of 1921 during maybe a 7-week period. One of them, Ernest Walker, was killed on Cordova Island, or the edge of Cordova Island, right basically on the sort of in the southern part of the city or southeastern part of the city. He was shot and killed in an area that there were many, many gunfights. John Watson was killed on the highway, or fatally wounded on the highway near Anthony. His partner, Bernard Holzman, had been a customs officer. His father had been a customs officer, and I think worked for Pat Garrett, the sheriff that killed Billy the Kid, who was a customs collector. And then Bernard Holzman survived that incident himself, and he became a member of the Border Patrol. 2 other prohibition agents, Agent Woods and Stafford Beckett, who had been a Texas Ranger, they were killed on a farm during a liquor raid in El Paso. And all of that happened in a 7-week period of time. Additionally, 2 members of the El Paso Police Department were murdered during that same, spring. So you had it was a very dangerous occupation, obviously, but among prohibition agents, you had a huge attrition rate, and many of those agents were killed. But it was still an agency that had, it was sort of a tarnished group. The customs officers and the immigration officers, at least in the Southwest, they had a better reputation, but they weren't without, scrutiny during that time. There were shooting incidents that were questionable. There were officers that were prosecuted. I cover a couple of those incidents in my book. In Arizona in 1929, a trio of patrol inspectors shot and killed a young man near Silver Bell, which is outside of Tucson. And that young man was unarmed, and it really upset the citizens there. And if you look over the records, the coroner's inquest files, the reports, 1929, you're talking almost a full decade of enforcement of these liquor laws. And you can tell that, people have sort of had it with this idea that, there's such a high attrition rate among people getting killed, on the border. Now, there's still a lot of respect. Anytime an officer was killed, there was usually a public outpouring of grief, which is, reasonable and totally understandable and right. But the laws they were enforcing were never completely popular. And, it was never going to end until it finally did. A big platform for the Democratic Party heading into the 1932 election was the end of Prohibition. That was a big deal. And even after Volstead and the 18th Amendment were repealed, there was still violence on the border associated with liquor. Texas still had the Dean Law for several years, which was their state prohibition law. So there were still restrictions on certain alcohol. And as a result, these federal officers, members of the Border Patrol, members of the Customs Service, were still having shootouts with liquor smugglers months, years after most of us think of the Prohibition era ending.
Well, you covered
gave you the longest answer in the world.
Well, but you covered a lot, because I was going to ask you about, not only the scrutiny, about Prohibition, but the scrutiny which was about the line riders themselves on the way that they handled things. Because in your book, you made mention that there was like very little training. Like they didn't go to a formal school of any kind. It was pretty much, you're on a horse, great, you're hired, and there was more to that, but you covered that part, because I would assume not every day did a line rider do everything by the book. And you covered that in the world's longest answer.
Yeah, I did. I'm sorry for that. But,
that was okay.
It was a bit of a ramble, but no, you're right. The training for a long time was pretty limited. Towards the end of the Prohibition era, into the early 30s, the Immigration Service established in El Paso a more formal training school for members of the Border Patrol, with emphasis on the law, on police procedure, on marksmanship, on immigration policy, on Spanish and foreign language. And they made huge improvements over that agency as they headed into the 30s and in the years before World War II. But for most of the period of time covered in the book, and especially in the years even before the Prohibition era, there was very little training. You might take some lessons in Spanish. You might go out into the desert with an older officer and fire a few practice rounds. If you were a member of the Border Patrol in the 20s, if you didn't own a gun, you were going to draw, a 1917 Colt News Service. They'd been provided to the agency from the Army after World War I. Most officers would go and buy their own weapons, so there wasn't like this sort of modern standardization of equipment. They started to wear uniforms. Both the Immigration Border Patrol and the Customs Service started to wear uniforms more regularly during the mid to late 1920s. And they had badges. But beyond that, there was not a lot of formal training and nothing like a modern day law enforcement, officer receives. Even a police officer in a small town anywhere in the United States, they generally go to a certified police academy to get state certification. And that's many weeks, if not months of training and then constant training throughout their careers. Officers back then, it was still very much the Old West, and there wasn't hardly any of that training available to these officers.
Well, there was a note in history that says when appointees began taking civil service exams in the 1890s, newspapers mocked the process. And here was the requirement. The requirements of work that a line rider must know the border, that he be handy with a horse, a good judge of contraband, mezcal and cigars, something of a trailer, meaning he's out following the trail of a bad guy or somebody that's smuggling whatever, contraband, and a fighter when in comfortable quarters with smugglers. So, no offense. I mean, if somebody's offended by the word, like, that dude was a badass. Like, holy crap. He's out there on a horse by himself in the middle of nowhere, taking on not the greatest people for very little pay. Like, that's badass 101.
Yeah, Jeff Milton, for example, who is a very famous lawman in the American West. He was a Texas Ranger. He was an express messenger for Wells Fargo. John Bosnecker has written about Jeff Milton. I've written about Jeff Milton. He was the chief of police in El Paso at one point, deputy United States Marshal. In the late 1880s, he was appointed as a mounted customs inspector to patrol the border in Arizona, and his salary was $3 per day, plus, like an additional 50 cents for horse and feed. That's a pretty modest, salary for dangerous work. I mean, it's outrageous even then. And it was a direct appointment. And so there really were no, requirements to take any kind of exams or anything. Well, in the 1890s, they started to impose stricter civil service regulations on this department, the Customs Service. And so officers or prospective officers found themselves having to take examinations that many of them who would otherwise have been qualified based on the standards of that newspaper statement. They could ride horses. Maybe they'd served as a deputy sheriff. They could handle a gun. They were good judge of contraband. They couldn't pass these exams. And so the collectors would complain because they're like, well, look, I'm going to get a bunch of school teachers as lawmen. I need people that can actually handle the requirements of this job. So in the early 1900s, they did away with the civil service requirements, if you will, for those customs officers. And they went back to a system where collectors, with quite a bit of latitude, could appoint officers as customs inspectors. Immigration Service, which became a separate service from the Treasury and Customs in the early 1900s, they didn't do that, so those officers still had to go through that process. But customs officers did not. And so it was very typical of a former Texas Ranger to apply or be appointed to one of these positions as a mounted customs inspector with very little testing or examination, anything like that. And so it was, for them, it was a very translatable job. It was very similar. Well, I've ridden the border as a Texas Ranger and lived in the outdoors and had a pack horse, and I guess I could just keep doing that for more money, working for the Department of the Treasury.
Crazy. At one point, was the military ever brought in to assist the line riders, or was the line riders enough?
The Army had, especially in the period I cover in the Line Riders, the book, the Army had a significant presence on the border during the 1910s and into the 1920s. They already had formal sort of installations like Fort Huachuca and Fort Bliss and other military installations, along or near the border. And so there had been the presence of the Army for many years. Of course, there was a significant mobilization effort in the years prior to America's entry into World War I, and that was because of the Mexican Revolution. And so during the 1910s, in addition to the regular Army, you had a lot of National Guard units from all over the country that were sent to the border. Some of that occurred during the era of the Punitive Expedition, which is when Pershing went into Mexico after Pancho Villa following the attack on Columbus, New Mexico. But you had a lot of other troops that were just posted near the border in places like Douglas, Arizona, and near El Paso. And early in the Prohibition era, a lot of those soldiers would get into fights with smugglers. And so a lot of these early battles, there were soldiers that would never hear a shot fired in anger in France, but heard a lot of shots fired in anger along the Rio Grande in these little firefights with gangs of smugglers who were coming across the border, either coming into the United States with liquor or crossing from the United States back into Mexico with other goods that were in high demand, lard, foodstuffs, ammunition, other things that were in demand during the later years of the revolution down there. So, yeah, the Army had a presence. They kind of participated in this sort of battle along the river over liquor. They didn't interact too much officially with customs officers. Occasionally, in late 1910s, early 1920s, there were some interactions where there might be a big fight and troops might, come out. There was a shootout in Smelter Town up near the Asarco Smelter in El Paso where a handful of immigration officers got into a really bad gunfight there. A couple of them were wounded. And one of the officers basically appealed to a lieutenant of a unit that was posted at the smelter. And that lieutenant took a detail down to the river, and those soldiers spent the entire night trading shots across the river with these smugglers. And two of the soldiers were pretty badly wounded during that fight.
Crazy. I'm telling you. An amazing story. Of course, we're talking to Sam Dolan. You can get his book on Amazon. It's called The Line Riders, the Border Patrol, Prohibition, and the Liquor War on the Rio Grande. Now, it's available at booksellers near you. The reason why we talk to you about Amazon, especially if you're listening all over the world, anywhere that you're listening to, is it really reduces shipping costs, and it's just I'm telling you. And wait till you see the cover. The cover. Let me ask you. We got about 10 minutes left. The picture
Sure.
on the cover. What picture is that?
Hey, that picture comes from the Arizona Historical Society, and it's a photograph in the Earl Fallis collection. He had served along the border, both in Texas and in Arizona. He was a pretty well-known member of the Immigration Service. He took a lot of photos, and the Arizona Historical Society has a good number of those. And in that photograph, you see a patrol inspector, I believe it's Carson Morrow on the cover. He's holding the rifle.
Right.
And they are disarming and apprehending three individuals. I'm not going to call them smugglers because there's not a lot of information about the photo. And in fact, I don't know if it's a real incident or if it's staged, but it's very typical of the types of encounters that these officers had. Where they've got pack animals, and if you look closely, Morrow's partner is pulling an automatic pistol out of the waistband of one of those guys. That picture comes from the Arizona Historical Society, which is, a well-known institution, and they have a wonderful archives and a wonderful selection of photographs, and that comes from those folks there in Tucson.
It's an awesome cover.
Morrow was quite an officer, the fellow holding the rifle. In early 1929, he was on the border near Nogales and had an encounter, and somebody stabbed him in the chest. And Morrow got out his automatic pistol and shot his assailant dead, and then walked back to his vehicle, which was quite a ways off, to try to get help. So, yeah, he was a pretty tough character, and he was on the border for a long time. He was a pretty well-known officer in the 30s and well after that, I think, into the 40s.
Well, I want to thank you, one, for coming on. And I also want to thank you for putting photos in the book. Like, there's a lot of photos in the book. And I think photos add into the person who's reading, especially like me, who doesn't really know a lot about it, and then they're able to read it and they're able to put a face or a picture with it. It's really a beautiful, beautiful book. And maps, you've got maps in there, you've got everything in there explaining about what's going on. It's really fantastic. What do you got coming up?
Well, I'm working on a couple things. I have some articles I've written for the Tombstone Epitaph, and one that I finished the other day, and a couple that are works in progress. And then I have another book that I'm working on, at least the proposal for, and doing a lot of research for, and that'll kind of, again, cover Borderlands topics that are sort of peripheral and connected to some of these other events. And I'm getting pretty excited about that. And that'll take me back down to Texas this year a couple of times. So I'm excited about a trip back down there, of course. And so I try to keep busy. Of course, I work as a television producer. This is my day job for a great company, Warm Springs Productions. And so that's my full-time work. And that's obviously, there's a lot that goes into that. But as a writer, I try to keep a few projects in the works, and I love doing the research and diving into these stories. So, I've got a couple things I'm working on.
Well, when you become big, like really big, and like we talked about on the pre-interview, and you're in your private jet and you fly over Phoenix, at least wave to me, make me feel good.
I don't know too many guys that do this sort of thing that get that big, but if it happens, I will for sure do that.
Well, you are an Emmy winner.
That's true.
You know, you do have that. We talked about it
yeah.
on the first interview. So
yeah, that's correct, and I'm proud of that. But I'm just a workaday, nonfiction TV producer, and I write these books and work on this history because I love it, and I think that's common amongst a lot of what I'd like to think of as peers. People like Chuck Parsons and Bob Alexander and John Bosnecker and Eric Wright. We love this history, and we love telling these stories and diving into the research, and it's because of that love for that material. That's why I work on these books, and I like sharing these stories.
Well, I'm glad you do. If you want to find a lot more about Sam, you can go to Samuel, and that's Samuel K. Dolan, DOLAN.com, SamuelKDolan.com. He has a website, and you can kind of see what's going on. He's got some cool stuff happening, and you can't order books there, but you can see the cool stuff that's happening. And of course, he's got his new book out called The Line Riders, The Border Patrol, Prohibition, and the Liquor War on the Rio Grand. That's available on Amazon. It's going to be a loaded question. I didn't ask the first time, but it's been kind of fun because I've been asking writers. Is there something about you that only you and your family would know that you would want to share? For example, when I asked that question to Chuck Parsons, Chuck said that he loves going to this little restaurant by his house where they have deep fried mushrooms with ranch dressing. And I'm like, holy crap, Chuck, I'm on the way. Is there something about you that, I obviously don't want to tell family secrets, but something that maybe you and your friends know about Sam that the rest of the public doesn't know, like a favorite food or a favorite place you like to go, or a watering hole.
Wow, that's a great question, Mike. I'm trying to think of something that would be along those lines. Other than the fact that I just have a great sense of humor and I'm hilarious most of the time, okay. I'm trying to think of something here that might be,
like, for example,
interesting.
I shared this one with the group a while back. I said, I used to work at Wendy's. I grew up in Garden Grove, California, which is down by Disneyland. And I worked at Wendy's, and Wendy's French fries dipped in a vanilla Frosty is so freaking good. And people were like, what? And I'm like, yeah, I'm telling you, just try it. It sounds disgusting. And then they tried it and they went, yeah, that's not bad. And that's one of my little Wendy's secrets is I like dipping French fries in a vanilla Frosty.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I wish I had something like that. I'm sure if I thought about it more, I would come up with something that would be fun to share. And I just am sort of drawing.
That's okay.
I'm drawing a blank.
Well,
but
for the next time.
For Yeah, that's funny about Chuck. Wow. It's good to know, though.
Yeah, I even asked Dr. Gary Roberts. I said, if you could get in a time machine and go back anywhere, where would you go? And he said he would like to go back to Doc's earliest days, where a lot of the documents were lost, and ask him
Sure.
certain questions about his childhood. They're just fun questions, and I was just I think you having a great sense of humor, because we only know you for the hour that we're speaking, and about your books and whatnot. So it's good to know that you've got a great sense of humor. Again, we're talking to Sam Dolan. You can find his book, which is called The Line Rider, The Border Patrol, Prohibition, and the Liquor War on the Rio Grand. You can find it's 416 pages, so it's not going to be a fast read. It's going to be a big, thick read, which means it's chock full of information and diagrams and maps and pictures, and you're going to love this one. And you can get it at Amazon. It goes for around $25. You're going to want to read it and probably do like I've done before with El Paso. I use El Paso now as a study guide or a reference guide when I'm reading someone else's book about Texas. I'll say, oh my gosh, I know about that. And I'll go back to El Paso and reread a certain area, because they go hand in hand. And you might end up doing the same with this. That's why I recommended you get El Paso and get this one together, because they're like a companion piece. I think it's going to be exactly what you're going to need. So as always, you can find me on Instagram at Cochise County Travels. You can also find me on YouTube at Cochise County Travels. This podcast will be on YouTube in the next week or so, or maybe even today. And you can find the podcast on Apple iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and the iHeartRadio app. We're broadcast in 6 countries, so you can find me anywhere on the World Wide Web. And, if you go to Stitcher or you go to Spotify or iTunes, please hit that subscribe button or the follow button and leave a rating and a review, because it does help with distribution. As always, I appreciate Sam, and the next time he's got something coming up, I will beg and plead, because by then he'll be up in the airplane waving down at the little people in Phoenix. No, that's not true. And but I urge you to do go back to the June 11th, 2022 interview, because he's got a fascinating story about his dad working in the movie Tombstone, some of his projects that he's been working on for television. He's got an amazing background, and you're going to want to listen to that one, because he's got an amazing story. Anything else, sir, before we go?
No, that should cover it, Mike. Other than I just wanted to thank you once again for including me. I enjoyed our conversation today, and thank you so much. And thank you for what you do for, the history of the Wild West and showcasing all of these great historians.
Well, and I learned from you guys and women, men and women. I learned from you because I'm a listening person. So when I can listen to it and I can put it to a book, it doubles the learning and the way I retain stuff. And I think a lot of people are the same way. So Happy New Year to everybody. Come back in January 2023. We've got an amazing man lined up, if everything goes as well, that you're going to want to hear. And in February, holy cow, February comes through and all the stars in the line. You're going to want to hear what's coming up at the end of February. It's going to be a fantastic interview. So thanks so much. I appreciate you a bunch. Until next time, safe travel.